That's right, we've got blood cults, decapitated archbishops, pummeling with ox bones, saintly relics, and so much more. I'm here in Canterbury, the city referred to as the Mother of England. It's not just one of the oldest cities in the country, it's also one of the strangest and most macabre. Now, some of you may know that I just recently completed the Canterbury Green Badge Guiding Qualification. And while I love giving a classic tour of Canterbury and all of its wonders, you know me, what I really love talking about is its dark and gruesome history. And that's what today's video is all about. Blood, bones, relics, and martyrs. We'll be wandering throughout the entire city, popping in and out of the legendary Canterbury Cathedral and focusing on some of the stories and myths that make Canterbury so fascinating. Now, if you're new to my channel, welcome. I'm so happy that you're here. If you're a regular viewer and you'd like access to even more videos every month, head on over to my Patreon channel, just linked above and below. There, I release at least one extra video a month, and you'll also get access to my archived videos. Now let's get started here at St. Dunstan's Church in Canterbury to visit the severed head of St. Thomas More. Now, before we visit Thomas More's head, let's talk a little bit about St. Dunstan himself. St. Dunstan was the Archbishop of Canterbury, that is, the highest ranking religious official in the country from 960 to 978. But while living as a religious hermit earlier in his life, he was known for metalworking. He is famous in folklore for defeating the devil by grabbing his nose with hot blacksmith tongs and attaching horseshoes to his feet. The devil was so desperate to remove the shoes that he agreed to give a wide berth to any home that hung a horseshoe above the door. That's just in case you were ever wondering where that tradition comes from. We can see this scene on the wall of the cloisters. There are 3 ceiling bosses here. A ceiling boss is a tile on a church or cloister ceiling. We're going to come back to talking about the other 2. These were removed during the Puritan rule of England in the 1650s. They were believed to encourage saint worship, but they've been recreated. Now here's the scene of St. Dunstan tonging the devil, and you got to be careful with your vowel placement with that one, and we'll come back to the other 2 a little bit later on. Now, this church was constructed in the 11th century, and in the 12th century it would become the first stop on King Henry's barefoot penitent walk through Canterbury, but we'll talk more about that a little bit later on. Today, St. Dunstan's Church is most known for being the final resting place of the head of St. Thomas More. Now, I don't want to go too much into the life of St. Thomas More here because I already have a great deal of information about him in my video about every tutor in the National Gallery. I've just linked that above. But essentially, More was a true Renaissance man. Literally. He was a 15th century lawyer, judge, philosopher, author, theologian, and most importantly, Lord High Chancellor to the notoriously fickle King Henry VIII. He opposed the Protestant Reformation and especially opposed Henry's cockamamie idea to annul his marriage to Queen Catherine and name himself as the head of the church in England. Thomas More refused to take the oath of supremacy, which stated that the monarch is the supreme governor of the church, and he was convicted of treason and beheaded at Tower Hill in 1535. His head was placed on a spike and installed on top of London Bridge, which was a custom at the time. Thomas More's daughter Margaret, obviously bereft at the loss of her beloved father, managed to get his head back. And she ferried it away here. Apparently, she carried it in her lap the whole way here from London. Here at St. Dunstan's Church was the family tomb of her husband, William Roper, and back then, the Roper family lived nearby. All that remains of their once grand home, Place House, is now the Roper Gate, which we can see here. So right now, we're here in the Nicholas Chapel and the Roper Chantry, and beneath our feet, we can find the Roper family vault. We can also have a look at the plaques and photos that are mounted on the wall, as well as the information boards. This is a little bit of archaeological excavation that was done in 1997, and we can indeed see proof that this is More's wizened head, and more details about when the vault was sealed. There's also some prayers that Sir Thomas More wrote, or should I say Saint Thomas More. In the Catholic faith, More is indeed a martyr and saint. He was canonized in 1935 by Pope Pius XI. Pope John Paul II then declared him the patron saint of statesmen and politicians in the year 2000. So while we can't actually see Thomas More's head on display, it is resting safely beneath my feet. And this is a wonderful church to come to visit. It's a great place for us to start our tour. But now let's head down the street and we're going to approach the massive Westgate and enter into Canterbury city walls. Okay, see if you can ignore the construction going on around me, but it's just such an impressive sight. This is the Westgate in Canterbury City Wall, the largest defensive gate in England. Also home to some murder holes. Now the city walls were built between 270 and 280, nearly 2,000 years ago, but it was refortified in the medieval period. The gate was added to the existing Roman walls in 1379, in the middle of the 100 Years' War between Britain and France. It was commissioned by Archbishop Sudbury. Now he would go on to meet a particularly violent end during the Peasants' Revolt. His head was paraded around Westminster, but we'll meet Sudbury a little bit later on. Now this tower, wow, I mean just look at it, this gate, was the height of technology when it was first built. It has a number of gun loops, which are round openings in castle walls like this one. Here's a few here as I'm entering into the city walls. And there's also one just behind me down on the left-hand side once I enter into the city gates. Authentic, right? Wrong. This is Victorian nonsense. Why would you have a gun loop facing into the city? But of course, the Victorians always liked to make things look more old-timey than they actually were. Now, the gate also had a very impressive portcullis. Now, that's a heavy iron gate that could be lowered to keep out unwanted visitors. And my favorite, it comes complete with these murder holes. These are holes in the floor that could be used to pour boiling oil to maim and even kill invaders. But they didn't always use boiling oil. There are records of murder holes like these ones in defensive gates being used for boiling excrement, which would be a horrible way to die. Remember, all of the other city gates in Canterbury were demolished in the late 18th century. You can see some images of them here, which was done for the ease of traffic. Westgate was thankfully spared for a number of reasons. I mean, it would have cost too much to demolish, and it was home to the town jail. A new jail would have had to be built, and that would have added to the cost. Today, it's home to a brilliant museum, which is filled with interesting artifacts and stories, as well as an escape room, which I think is really fitting for the fact it used to be a jail. You can actually even have a pint and burger in the restaurant next door and eat them in a former jail cell. St. Alphege is another of Canterbury's archbishops who met a gruesome end and was then canonized. By the way, 5 archbishops of Canterbury in total have met gruesome and violent ends. 3 of them were murdered and 2 of them were executed judicially. 2 of the 3 that were murdered were later canonized. Now, Alphege was from Bath and he knew St. Dunstan personally. We think Dunstan personally recommended Alphege to be Bishop of Winchester back in 984, just a few years before his death. In Winchester, Alphege really promoted the cult of Saint Swithin, a former Bishop of Winchester. In 1006, when Alphege became Archbishop of Canterbury, he translated Swithin's head here to the city, though it has sadly been lost. By the way, translated is the correct term when you're talking about moving the relics of a saint. This church was probably initially built around 1030, but it was rebuilt around 1070 by Archbishop Lanfranc. He was the Archbishop of William the Conqueror, and there were more additions made in the 13th and 15th centuries. Today, it is the uniform shop for the King's School, but we can learn an awful lot about St. Alphege's life and his gruesome end over at Canterbury Cathedral, and that's where we're going to head next. See, Canterbury Cathedral is known for its vibrantly colored stained glass windows, some of the oldest in the country. It was during this attack that the Danes kidnapped and murdered Alphege. The windows are high up and quite hard to see, but I'll zoom in. We have 3 12th century panes that are still intact here, telling the tale of the bloody Viking siege of Canterbury in September 1011. We haven't talked much about Vikings on my channel, but we will in the future, especially when I go to York. We need to remember that in the 10th and 11th centuries, England was pummeled by Viking attack and even had 4 Danish kings. They have the best names, by the way: Sweyn Forkbeard, Canute the Great, Harold Harefoot, and Hartha Canute. In 1011, under the rule of Canute the Great, a fearsome warlord known as Torkel the Tall came back to Kent to try to extract more money from the population. A few years earlier, they had already paid him £3,000 worth of silver, and he wanted more. The Saxons of Canterbury were ready, though, and they fought back, and the Vikings just weren't prepared for the counterattack. This led to a bloody 3-week siege. The upper window shows 4 Danes outside the city walls. You can see the city gate there. The Danes are dressed in chainmail and attacking with swords, lances, and shields. Inside of the walls, we can see the Saxon defenders fighting off the attack with their lances, shields, and handheld stones. Torkel's men were eventually victorious, and they sacked the city, burned down parts of the cathedral, butchered many citizens, and captured Archbishop Alphege. Here he is here on the left, dressed in his mitre and chasuble, being attacked by the Danes. Look, in the final surviving panel, we can see them carrying Alphege off to Greenwich, where they had their winter camp. The Danes held Alphege for 7 long months and attempted to ransom him in exchange for gold and silver, but he refused to allow himself to be traded. After inflicting torture on him, the Vikings finally took him to a field where they pelted him mercilessly with ox bones. In addition to the scene shown in the stained glass, of course, you can also see the martyrdom of St. Alphege here in the ceiling boss. The Vikings are holding ox bones in their hands above a praying Alphege. A Dane called Thrum is said to have stepped forward to end this suffering with his battle axe, and it's this axe wound that probably ended Alphege's life. After this brutal incident, many Danes switched sides to fight on behalf of the Saxons, including Torkel the Tall himself, the instigator of the whole thing. Alphege was soon canonized for his martyrdom, and this church, St. Alphege in Greenwich, was built on the site of his murder. And remember, this St. Alphege here in Canterbury was built a few decades later. I'm standing on the site here at St. Alphege Church, Greenwich, where St. Alphege was martyred. Now, St. Alphege was entombed here in Canterbury Cathedral, but this was tragically destroyed during the Reformation. Here is the site of his grave. After his death, he became the favorite saint of the English until the murder of Thomas Becket and his canonization 200 years later. Just one more note about St. Alphege before we move on. You can see the sign for the City Arms pub just behind me. The sign features the crest of the city of Canterbury. There's 3 choughs, that's a corvid bird similar to a crow or a raven. Those birds represent the birds that apparently landed and drank the blood of St. Thomas. But you can also see it says Ave Mater Angliae, which means Hail the Mother of England. But then above the regal lion, you can also see a royal crown. This crown, the royal symbol, was gifted to Canterbury for use back in 1011 by King Canute. He felt so guilty about the murder of St. Alphege that he lent his royal insignia for Canterbury to use ever since. Now let's move on to another murdered Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury. Now I mentioned him briefly when we were talking about the Westgate because his body was actually hanged off of the side of it for a short time. But it's here in Canterbury Cathedral that we can see a few mementos of his life and death. This is a stone tile called the Talbot Hound. Sudbury's coat of arms was a Talbot Hound, and this one is sculpted in stone on the wall here in the nave. Sudbury was Bishop of London from 1361 to 1375, and then Archbishop of Canterbury from 1375 to the end of his life in 1381. For that last year of his life, he was also the Chancellor of England. He had a lot of power, and some thought it was a conflict of interest. See, in the late 1370s, tension was fomenting amongst peasants across the country. They were sick of toiling for long hours in the fields with little to show for it. The lord of the manor was reaping all of the benefits. I mean, that still kind of sounds familiar. After the plagues of the mid-14th century, there were far fewer people to work the fields, and the people that remained were exhausted, poor, and angry. Things really came to a head, pun intended, when young Richard II came to the throne. He was only 14 years old, and he implemented a new tax. This tax was to pay for a war with France, and the peasants were required to pay just as much as the nobles were out of their meager earnings. A man named Wat Tyler, who may or may not have actually been a real man, who's said to have come from Kent, decided to lead a rebellion of the peasants, and they stormed their way to London. London was unarmed at the time because the king's men were actually somewhere else. They stormed and burned down the Savoy Palace and made their way to the Tower of London. That just happened to be where Simon of Sudbury was saying Mass. Simon of Sudbury was so very unpopular with the rebellious peasants that the guards simply allowed the heaving mob through the gates, allowing them full access to both Sudbury and Robert Hales, the Lord Treasurer. See, both of these men were seen as responsible for the taxes. They were dragged to Tower Hill, and Sudbury was beheaded by 8 sword blows to his neck. The axeman, or men, were so frenzied that they accidentally cut the fingers off of his hand as well. Sudbury's body lay out all day, but that night his clerical hood was nailed onto his severed head and was fixed to a pole, then placed on London Bridge. Where else? Afterwards, his body was brought here to Canterbury. For a time, it was hanged off of the side of Westgate, then brought here to Canterbury Cathedral. After 6 days, Lord Mayor of London, William Walworth, decided to reclaim the body, and Sudbury's severed head was taken back to Sudbury, where today it still is kept at St. Gregory's Church. This is neat. This is a facial reconstruction based on a 2011 CT scan of Sudbury's mummified skull. But now, back here to Canterbury Cathedral, this is Sudbury's tomb. It contains his body, but remember, his head is in Suffolk. In its place is a lead cannonball, which is so bizarre. This sarcophagus is missing its original gilt copper effigy, which was destroyed during the English Reformation, but we can still see the elaborately carved stone canopy. Since we're in Canterbury Cathedral right now, I think it's time for us to talk about the 2 archbishops of Canterbury who were executed by judicial means, William Laud and Thomas Cranmer. Let's swing quickly into the chapter house. I want to show you the only references, really, in Canterbury Cathedral to these men. Now, I have skipped over Becket, but don't worry, we will come back to him a bit later on. In these stained glass panels, we can see the untimely ends of these archbishops who were convicted and tried for heresy and executed in gruesome ways. Now, let's talk first about Thomas Cranmer. He features in the second part to my Tutors in the National Portrait Gallery video. His rise to power takes us back to the life of King Henry VIII. In some ways, he was the polar opposite to Thomas More, eager to embrace the new Church of England. He was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 1533 and secured Henry VIII's divorce from Catherine of Aragon later that same year. He was a committed Protestant and is responsible for a lot of the rites and rituals still used in the Church of England. However, he was later imprisoned for his Protestant beliefs by Mary I, and we'll come back to some more of her Protestant martyrs at the end of our tour. She had him tried for treason. Under duress and having just witnessed Bishops Ridley and Latimer burned at the stake, Cranmer acknowledged papal supremacy and the truth of Roman Catholic doctrines, except transubstantiation, but he recanted and reaffirmed his Protestant beliefs. You can see him being forced to listen to a sermon by the Provost of Eton before being burnt at the stake in Oxford on the 21st of March, 1556. Next up, we're going to talk about Archbishop Laud. Now, I talk a lot about Archbishop Laud in my video about more macabre things in London's churches, because some of his artifacts, including this prayer book, are at St. Catherine Cree Church in the old city of London. By the way, my very first Patreon video ever was also a tour of St. Catherine Cree Church. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. Laud was a staunch supporter of Charles I, and Charles I appointed him Archbishop of Canterbury in 1633, exactly 100 years after Thomas Cranmer. Something about 33. However, Laud eventually fell out of favour with Charles I, partially for being too much of a supporter, if you can believe it. Laud was accused of treason, and part of the evidence used against him was actually the consecration of St. Catherine Cree Church. His ceremony was said to be too Catholic in nature. The Grand Remonstrance of 1641 called for his imprisonment, and he was locked up in the Tower of London. In 1645, he was found guilty of treason and executed on Tower Hill, which we can see in the window panel. This is one of my favorite things in Canterbury Cathedral. This is a Transi tomb, or cadaver tomb, of another archbishop, Henry Chichele. Now, he didn't meet a violent end. Quite the contrary, he was beloved throughout his life. He was Archbishop of Canterbury between 1414 and 1443, but this was actually erected in 1425 during his lifetime so that he could benefit from it and contemplate his own mortality for 18 years before his death. Let's just pause and regard it. It's absolutely stunning. Yes, it's old, but look at how detailed and colorful the top is. There he is in all of his glory, looking like he has just passed away. It's almost easy to miss the gruesome figure on the bottom level. Yes, that is Chichele himself, his corpse wasted and emaciated. Now, normally effigies take the shape of a person who resides in the tomb below, an idealized statue of a person during their lifetime. We usually see effigies for kings, queens, bishops, and nobles in places like Westminster Abbey, and of course here at Canterbury Cathedral. Here's Henry IV, for example. But Transis are different. These funerary effigies feature a skeleton or an extremely emaciated or decomposing body, and they were common in the Middle Ages here in England and also in France. Now, why would you want to honor an important person with a likeness of their rotting flesh? Well, this was designed to remind viewers of the transience and vanity of mortal life, which should be in contrast to the eternity of the Christian afterlife. Let's not get Transis confused with gisants. These are also effigies, but they are in full dress with open eyes and their hands clasped in prayer. I feature a wonderful gisant in my video in the Off the Beaten Track Louvre. Skip to the chapter on the tomb of Philippe Pot. Cadaver monuments first appear around the 1380s, and they remained popular for the next few centuries, with the name Transi coming to refer to the transition from life to decomposition. Over time, the depictions became more realistic and actually quite gruesome, featuring the deceased being eaten by worms and maggots. Speaking of worms, let's read the inscription translated from Latin. I was a pauper born, then to primate raised. Now I am cut down and served up for worms. Behold my grave. Whoever may be who will pass by, I ask you for your remembrance. Well, he certainly has my remembrance. Again, I want to remind you that this was here for like 20 years before he died, so he got to regard his own rotting flesh as he contemplated his daily prayers. We're going to leave Canterbury Cathedral for a few minutes and head down the road to talk about Thomas Becket, but don't worry, we'll be back. Now, we can't come to Canterbury without talking about its most famous saint, in fact, one of Europe's most famous saints in the Middle Ages, St. Thomas Becket, and this story is about as gruesome and macabre as it gets. He was one of England's and even Europe's most celebrated saints before King Henry VIII had his shrine destroyed. More on that a bit later on. Now, I don't want to hear you say St. Thomas à Becket. That's a Victorian affectation, and St. Thomas Becket certainly doesn't need our poncery to be impressive. Born on Cheapside in London in 1119 or 1120, he was a bright student and ended up running in the same circles as King Henry II. He rose through the ranks to first become Chancellor and then Archbishop of Canterbury. The king was delighted with this, as he thought Thomas would put the crown first, above the church. However, with his new responsibility, Thomas became more pious than ever, some would even say ascetic in nature, and he was unwilling to do what the king wanted. The king began sullying his reputation, and Becket was officially and pointedly asked to agree to the king's rights over the church, or face political repercussions if he didn't. But Becket wouldn't capitulate. He was soon convicted of contempt of royal authority and malfeasance. King Louis of France, he's the one who built Notre Dame, offered him protection in France, and Becket fled to the continent. 5 years later, and after arbitration sent by Pope Alexander III in Rome, Henry was more open to allowing Becket to come back to England and return to his duties in a way that would allow everybody to save face. That is not what happened. That's because, in the meantime, the Archbishop of York was doing something sneaky. He was crowning the heir apparent, Henry the Young King, at York Minster. This violated Canterbury's hard-won privilege of coronation, and in November 1170, Becket excommunicated all three. That made the king apoplectic. Now this might be apocryphal, but according to legend, 4 of his knights heard Henry II utter, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" After a day of drinking here at an inn held inside this building, Conquest House, its original foundations do date back to the 12th century, the knights decided to curry favor with the king. By the way, other sources say that Henry actually said, "What miserable drones and traitors have I nourished and brought up in my household, who let their lord be treated by such shameful contempt by a low-born cleric?" But the turbulent priest line is a lot easier to remember. On 29th December 1170, the 4 men hid their weapons outside and covered their armor with cloaks. Other monks attempted to prevent them from coming in, but Becket said to open the door. He said it was not right to make a house of prayer a fortress. When the doors reopened, the knights, wielding their drawn swords, ran about shouting, "Where is Thomas Becket, traitor to the king and country?" They tried to pull him outside, but Becket pulled onto a pillar and prayed, saying he was ready to meet his death. Here in what is now called the Martyrdom, we can see this modern memorial. It's a dramatic sculpture representing the 4 swords of the 4 knights. 2 swords with reddened tips and their 2 shadows, and this was created by sculptor Giles Blomfield. This is indeed where St. Thomas was murdered, but we can also see the act taking place on another of the recreated ceiling bosses in the cloisters. Even more dramatic is this painting in the Beanie Museum by John Opie. A little too dramatic, actually. He wasn't nearly this old and stooped, but it makes for a good painting. One of the first blows sliced off the top of his head, and then he fell to his knee when the final decisive blow was delivered. A cleric accompanying the knights smashed his brains across the floor. Head wounds bleed very heavily, and his blood drenched the stones, and it's then that it's said the chuffs came to drink of his blood. But to learn more about St. Thomas Becket's blood, we need to head back outside to the Rush Market. This was the site of the old medieval rush market. You see, during the Middle Ages, rushes, or dried river grass, were used to cover the earthen floors in most houses, sometimes woven into mats and sometimes loose. It was really important to keep the rushes hydrated. So look up on the wall here. You can see a red pump mounted up high, a replica of the original on this site. The water source was often referred to as the, quote, red well. According to local lore, it used to produce red-tinged water. Now, you and I might be tempted to believe that either the pump was rusty or it was drawing iron-rich waters from the nearby Chalybeate Springs, but that sounds like you and I are not believers in the blood cult of Thomas Becket. See, the blood was an integral part of the mythos surrounding Becket, and it was the reason he was canonized so quickly. In the hours and days after Becket's murder, people would dip their cloths into the blood, and some of these are credited with the early miracles of Becket. For instance, a man took this cloth home and for some reason made it into a drink of water for his wife to consume. When she drank the bloody water, she was cured of her terminal illness. Hundreds of other miracles were soon attributed to him, which we can see in some of these stained glass windows. The faithful throughout Europe began venerating Becket as a martyr, and on the 21st of February 1173, little more than 2 years after his death, he was canonized by Pope Alexander III. Henry II soon realized that he had to do something to show the public that he was penitent for his role in Thomas Becket's death. In 1174, his penitent walk started at Harbledown Hospital, and then, remember, he went to St. Dunstan's, where he removed his fine clothes and shoes and dressed only in a shirt with a hunting cape to keep off the torrential rain. He walked barefoot to the Westgate, into the city, and into the cathedral. Becket's remains were translated to a special new chapel built especially for him. Here's a scholarly recreation of this chapel that was destroyed by Henry VIII. Thousands of pilgrims began making their way here. After that, people realized that something special was happening in Canterbury. They wanted access to the blood, to the, quote, St. Thomas's waters, and that's what really drove those early pilgrimages. They became a massive industry, which of course you can read about in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Now, thankfully, the limited quantity of Thomas Becket's blood had the magical ability to multiply and keep all of these vendors in business. Imagine that. Local sellers would bottle the red water from this well and sell it to pilgrims as the blood of the saint, thought to have miraculously curative properties. Not a bad business venture. You could purchase small ampulla or bottles decorated with the martyrdom scene of Becket's murder to keep your Thomas's water in. By the way, it was said that if you brought your own flask from home, that the holy water would break it. So you had to buy it from the sellers here in Canterbury. Of course, this also made a perfect souvenir, along with pilgrims' badges, to show that you'd been in the shrine. This, by the way, is a mold of one of those ampulla here at the Beanie Museum. So this pump wasn't just a practical object. People fully believed that the blood of the saint was flowing beneath the streets of Canterbury. This really is the only saint's cult in Christian history where the followers drink the blood of the saint. And yes, this is definitely strange. It did freak some people out, but it was a big business. Monks condoned it, and there was a lot of money to be made. A few years ago, the British Museum did an exhibit on the blood cult of Thomas Becket called Murder and the Making of a Saint, where they featured many objects associated with Becket, including pilgrims' badges like these. In 1538, Henry VIII dissolved all of the monasteries in the country and founded his new religion, the Church of England. He destroyed his grand shrine and burnt his body, scattering the ashes to the wind. Here you can see a candle burning where the original shrine to Thomas Becket was located. Some say Becket's body may have actually been hidden away and is still buried here in the cathedral. Let me know if you'd like a video about the mystery of Becket's bones. Now, from 1538 to 1875, there was nowhere in Canterbury to venerate St. Thomas Becket until the construction here of St. Thomas Becket Roman Catholic Church. Let's head inside. The church is home to two of St. Thomas's relics, a bit of his vestments and his finger bone. They were said to have been saved and squirreled away to Italy and then returned here to Canterbury when this church opened. It's a far cry from the massive pre-1538 shrine where you could actually reach your hand through holes like these and touch the saint's skull, but we're really lucky that they're here at all. By the way, there are also the relics of another saint here in Canterbury, those of St. Oscar Romero, a 20th century saint. This is one of his stoles. He was a Salvadoran archbishop who spoke out against the violence of government armed forces, right-wing groups, and leftist guerrillas. He was shot during Mass in 1980 and was canonized by Pope Francis in 2018. Now, that was a whistle-stop tour through Becket lore. He really was the most important saint, not just in this country, but in most of Europe for hundreds of years before Henry VIII had his shrine destroyed. The windows behind me are actually really hilarious, some of them showing off rather humorous depictions of St. Thomas Becket performing miracles, but also threatening those who did not make sufficient donations to Canterbury Cathedral. I could do an entire video just on these windows in the future if you're interested. We're back outside now, and we're just on one of the bridges crossing the Stour. Now look straight ahead. You can see this strange seat jutting out over the water. This is a replica of a ducking stool, along with a scold's harness used to punish scolds and other women who deserved a good lesson for not knowing their place in early modern England. I can think of a few men who could have used a turn on this stool, but I digress. Now, contrary to popular belief, this ducking stool was not used to swim witches. To swim a witch, that's a nice way of putting it, you threw them into frigid water. If they sank, they were presumed innocent and pulled out of the water with a rope, maybe in time to save their life, and maybe not, most likely not. If they floated, well, they were presumed guilty and put on trial and would likely be publicly hanged or maybe even burnt at the stake. The practice of swimming witches until they died did happen in England in the 17th century. There's just no evidence of it happening here in Canterbury and not on the Stour. But people were certainly burnt at the stake here in Canterbury, though not for witchcraft. Let's head to our final stop, the Martyrs Monument. Now we're here in the Wincheap area of Canterbury, outside the Canterbury city walls, but on the opposite end from where we started at St. Dunstan's Church. This is the Canterbury Martyrs Memorial, in memory of 41 Kentish martyrs who were burned at the stake at this very spot, or somewhere nearby, in the reign of Queen Mary I. These burnings took place in 1555 to 1558. And as the memorial says here, its inscription, for themselves they earned the martyr's crown. For their historic fidelity, they helped to secure for succeeding generations the priceless blessing of religious freedom. Now we need to understand, of course, why Queen Mary I, also known as Bloody Mary, was so hell-bent on having people like this made an example of, with the ultimate punishment, being burnt alive at the stake. Remember, Mary takes the throne after her younger brother, King Edward VI, dies at just the age of 14 years old. He'd been a sickly child for his entire life. And we have to remember that, of course, their shared father was King Henry VIII. Henry VIII, of course, just a few decades earlier, had dissolved the monasteries across the country, destroyed things like St. Thomas Becket's shrine, and changed the head of the English Church from being the Pope in Rome to being himself the King of England. Let's also not forget that, in addition to many complicated reasons, one of the main reasons that Henry wanted to found this new religious order was to be able to get a divorce or annulment from Mary's very mother, Catherine of Aragon, his first wife. Now, after marrying Anne Boleyn and having one daughter, Elizabeth, later known as Elizabeth I, Henry would go on to marry 4 more times. But he only has one surviving son, with Jane Seymour, his son Edward. Edward, who lived a life of poor health, decided to enshrine the right of his cousin, Jane Grey, also a fierce Protestant, to become the monarch if he were to die young. And this is what very almost did happen. But at the last minute, many supporters who had assured Edward that they would support Jane Grey decided instead to back Mary I. Now, Mary may have been Catholic, which made her unpopular with some people, but they really wanted to have Henry's blood child on the throne, not his niece, even though she too did have a lineage claim to the throne herself. Now, when Mary came to the throne, she decided to make England Catholic again, and this was part of her propaganda campaign. Take people that were influential members of their community and who spoke out against the Catholic Church, and make an example of them by burning them alive at the stake. One of the most famous instances of this, or I should say infamous, is the execution of Thomas Cranmer, who we've already spoken about. And there is another martyrs memorial in Oxford, where he and 2 others were burnt at the stake. But this martyrs memorial lists the names of 41 people. And what I find really interesting is that you can see a lot of women. At a time when women had very little influence, both in the church and in the community in terms of politics and governance, we can see that there are 11 women here. Now that's 25%. For many of them, their only crime was non-attendance. That is, they just simply didn't go to church. Sadly, some of them here listed purely as widow, Bradbridge's widow, Wilson's wife. Bradbridge's widow was probably of Tenterden in Kent, and she may have been the widow of Martin Bradbridge, who was burnt on 16th January 1557. On 12th of July 1555, John Bland, John Frankish, Nicholas Shetterton, and Humphrey Middleton were burnt together. They, quote, resigned themselves with Christian fortitude, fervently praying that God would receive them into his heavenly kingdom. Not all of these 41 were burnt here at this site, but we know that the stake was erected very close to here for the burnings that took place on the 31st of January 1556. That's when John Lomas, Agnes Snoth, Joan Stool, and Joan Cranmer were burnt alive at the stake here. I know it's really a trope, especially when it comes to witches being burned alive at the stake, but when you think about it, it really is the most horrible way to die. Up at the top of the monument, you can see the Canterbury cross. A small brooch like this one was discovered in a dig near St. George's Gate in Canterbury and has since come to be used as a symbol of the Anglican Church all over the world. It's a very fitting symbol here for the Kentish Martyrs. So that's the end of our tour. I hope that you've enjoyed spending time with me here in Macabre, Canterbury, and let me know if you'd be interested in more tours about this amazing city. To me, other than London, it's the most interesting place in the country. Remember, if you'd like to learn more about Canterbury, I've got a video about Canterbury's Beanie Museum up on my Patreon channel. I'll see you the next time I'm at the museum.